When I tell people the worst day of my life started with a headache, they don't believe me. But it did. That headache sent me home early, and instead of peace and quiet, I walked in on my girlfriend in bed with a 19-year-old college kid. I lost control, threw punches, and within minutes, I wasn't just the betrayed boyfriend. I was in handcuffs, facing aggravated assault charges that could put me away for years. She cheated, he cried, and I'm the one looking at prison. And it all came from what seemed like a harmless, ordinary day. The ordinary day that turned into chaos. The day itself couldn't have started more unremarkably. It was a Tuesday that blended into every other Tuesday. Emails, weak coffee, and the kind of half-dead shuffle through tasks that doesn't deserve more than a passing memory. By mid-morning, a headache had settled in. Nothing spectacular, just enough to make staring at my screen unbearable. I told myself I'd push through, but by noon, it felt like my skull was its own drumline. That's when I made the call to head home early. A nap seemed like the best medicine. On paper, going home sounded responsible. Take care of yourself, avoid burning out. In reality, it became the most disastrous decision I've ever made. I left work with nothing more on my mind than silence and darkness behind closed blinds. I had no hint that walking out a couple hours early was going to redirect my entire life. The drive back was short and uneventful. My girlfriend and I had been together for 3 years, and we shared a small 2-bedroom apartment just a few minutes from my office. Pulling into the lot, I pictured dropping my bag by the door and heading straight to nap territory. I didn't walk in expecting anything other than quiet. If anything felt unusual, it was only that I was relieved to get off the road and finally rest. I slid the key into the lock, went through the motions, bag down, shoes off, trying not to think about my headache. The place felt still, but I brushed it off, chalking it up to her maybe having headphones on or already taking a nap. Nothing in that silence screamed warning. It just felt like a normal afternoon waiting to start. That's what makes the moment so sharp in my memory. Because the second I pushed open our bedroom door, normal disappeared. Instead of calm, I walked straight into the kind of scene you only believe happens to someone else. There was my girlfriend, the person I'd built 3 years of my life with, and a 19-year-old college kid in our bed. Not sitting, not pretending, mid-action, tangled up on sheets that yesterday had been ours. Everything froze. Them. Me. The air in the room. My girlfriend scrambled away, like being caught, made it vanish, and the kid just stayed there, half-dressed, staring at me like a deer caught in headlights. For half a second, my brain didn't process it. I stood there locked in place, the shock hitting so hard it erased the pounding in my head. Turns out, the headache was the smallest problem of my day. My body reacted before my mind did. Adrenaline surged up, sharp enough that I could feel my hands tremble. My chest tightened, heart charging forward like it wanted out. It was disbelief and anger smashing into each other at the same time, so intense that I couldn't decide which one got control first. The sight cracked to open something I didn't know I had in me. 1 second I was frozen, the next I felt like I was about to explode. That instant, that image is the marker between my old life and the mess that followed. One moment, I was a guy complaining about a headache. The next, I was standing in my own doorway, blindsided, watching everything I trusted fall apart in front of me. And before I could even process what came next, the scene itself shifted into something I wasn't prepared for at all. Walking into the wrong movie scene. Walking into that room felt like stepping onto a stage I didn't know existed. 1 second I was turning a doorknob, ready to collapse on my bed, and the next I was staring down a scene I wasn't supposed to see. She was tangled up in the sheets with someone who didn't look old enough to rent a car. 19. A college kid. My girlfriend of 3 years, 26 years old, with someone barely out of high school textbooks. The whole thing stopped cold the instant I appeared. I didn't move. They didn't move. She scrambled off him, clumsy and frantic, as if covering herself would erase everything I just walked in on. The kid froze on my bed, half-dressed, wide-eyed, looking like he'd just been caught shoplifting for the first time. That detail hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just about betrayal. It was about the absurdity. My home had turned into the world's most humiliating stage play, and I was cast as the accidental audience. For a beat, nothing registered. I could see the mess, the shoes kicked to the corner, clothes knotted on the floor, sheets twisted out of place, but my brain refused to arrange the picture into something real. It was as if the frame of my life cracked in half. The reality I thought I lived in didn't line up with what I was seeing. I wasn't crying, I wasn't yelling, I was blank, like the signal had cut out and left me staring at static. And yes, that numbness didn't last. Heat burned beneath the surface of my skin. Confusion dug its claws into anger, and I could feel control slipping before I'd even opened my mouth. I wasn't standing in disbelief anymore. I was building towards something that couldn't be contained. The silence of that room pressed in from every direction. Nobody said a word. She half raised her hand, maybe to explain, maybe to apologize, but nothing came out yet. The kid didn't even try to get up. He sat there, pale, half naked, as if staying still might erase him from the scene altogether. My own chest felt tight, air grinding in and out, while my head screamed at me to react. The strangeness of it all cut even deeper. This was our bedroom, our bed, our space. 3 years of shared life, torn apart in a single image. Seeing her tangled with him peeled away every piece of trust I thought I had. Suddenly, it wasn't mine anymore. It was just a stage for something ugly, and I had been shoved into the spotlight without warning. Shock still hung in the air, but underneath it, anger was moving in quickly, shouldering everything else aside. It burned hot and sharp, a split-second surge that left no room for patience. My fists felt heavy, my breath uneven. I wasn't calm. I wasn't about to weigh my options. I was a man staring at catastrophe, teetering on the edge of doing something I couldn't take back. And that edge, it came fast. Faster than I thought possible. Because in that silent, frozen room, it was only a matter of time before the stillness shattered. When it did, my reaction wasn't measured, and it sure wasn't the kind you describe as rational. The excuses that deserve awards. The first sound to break through the stillness wasn't mine. It was hers. My girlfriend, jolted into a frenzy of words, panicked lines spilling out in every direction. And the very first thing she threw at me, with clothes half on and guilt written across her face, was, "It doesn't mean anything." Hearing that in my own bedroom made my skin crawl. The sheer absurdity of it snapped something inside me. Here I was staring at a 19-year-old kid tangled in the sheets we slept on, and her defense was to act like what I just witnessed was a casual accident. It wasn't a misstep you could brush off like knocking over a coffee cup. It was a betrayal so obvious it scorched itself into my memory forever. She kept talking, piling more words on top of that insult. "You're misunderstanding. This isn't important. I still love you." Each line rolled out like she believed stacking explanations would somehow outweigh the evidence in front of me. But nothing she said did anything except magnify how wrong it all was. Panic makes people talk too much, and she was filling the silence with excuses that sprayed humiliation onto the wound. The kid even tried to speak. His voice barely made it out, shaky and cracked, muttering how he didn't know she had a boyfriend. Like that helped. He looked less like an accomplice and more like some freshman caught sneaking past curfew. But she cut him off, talking over him, desperate to steer the spotlight back toward me, as if controlling the words would control the story. That first excuse, though it doesn't mean anything, is what rooted itself in my head. Because the more I turned it over, the worse it got. What she meant is damage control burned hotter than silence ever could. Saying it didn't mean anything didn't shrink the betrayal. It stretched it wider. If it really was meaningless, if there was no weight behind it, then why sacrifice everything we built for something disposable? That reasoning only stripped away the last shred of respect in the wreckage. One line is all it took. It was like someone driving your car into a wall, then smiling and saying, "Relax, it didn't mean anything." You're still standing in front of a crushed engine, and your life doesn't magically go back to normal because they framed it like it barely mattered. In that moment, that single excuse carried more venom than silence ever could have. She stood there with her hands half raised, her voice sharp and shaky, circling the words as if repeating them would somehow resuscitate things. But I wasn't nodding, I wasn't softening, and I definitely wasn't convinced. Every time she spoke, it felt like an attempt not just to excuse what she'd done, but to rewrite my reaction before I even had one. That turned disbelief into rage, because the moment she tried to minimize it, she wasn't only cheating, she was also making me out to be unreasonable for not accepting her version. What gnaws at me now is how those lines later turned into something even sharper. In the aftermath, when neighbors and police showed up, she reshaped the story. Suddenly I wasn't the cheated on boyfriend standing in shock. I was the violent one, the monster she needed to defend herself against. The irony of that shift still grates. In that room, she was the one scrambling, swearing it didn't mean anything, eyes wide, words frantic. Hours later, the same person was painting herself terrified, as though I was the danger from the very beginning. That was the start of how the narrative flipped entirely out of my hands. But in the doorway, before all of that unraveling, I was locked onto her excuses. Every word she chose stripped away accountability and shoved salt deeper into the wound. She wasn't just betraying me, she was discrediting me, demanding I accept what I'd seen as smaller than it was. That desperation to smooth over the wreckage only made the flames burn hotter. The boy sat frozen through it all, looking for an opening to escape, while she kept talking herself deeper. It was chaos disguised as conversation, and my own body was betraying me, hands tight, chest constricted, heat rising fast. She thought she was putting out a fire. To me, she was spilling gasoline and refusing to see the sparks. And her noise wasn't easing me back, it was speeding me forward, dragging me past disbelief and into something I couldn't step out of once I crossed it. Each repetition of "it doesn't mean anything" hit like a shove, pushing me further from reason and closer to eruption. That final echo of her voice still reverberated in my head. By the time it landed one last time, there was no space left for shock. Just a tide rising higher than I could control, one that had nowhere to go but outward. And in that charged silence that followed her excuses, I could feel the next part beginning, the moment where something inside me tipped, and everything that had been bottled up was about to break loose. Rage mode unlocked. Rage mode doesn't come with warning lights. It just flips on. 1 second I was still hearing her excuses echo in my head, and the next, my chest was pounding, fists clenched, teeth grinding like they had a mind of their own. A wall of heat swallowed up the shock I'd been frozen in. My body took control before my brain had time to argue. That's the scariest part. Rage is fast. Like I'd suddenly body-snatched the Hulk, except this wasn't some epic showdown in an arena. It was just me, a college kid who shouldn't have been there, and the ruins of my relationship all piled on one flimsy mattress. Fury that big inside four walls doesn't look heroic. It looks sloppy, loud, and terrifying. And here's the kicker. It wasn't destiny, fate, or some unstoppable instinct. It was me making choices, ugly ones, in a state where reason had packed up and left the room. The shift came quickly. I moved forward before I even thought go. The kid didn't fight. He didn't run. He just froze, wide-eyed, like a deer staring down headlights he couldn't dodge. And somehow, that made it worse. Seeing him there, half naked in my bed, perfectly still, was like pouring gasoline straight onto the fury I already felt sparking inside me. My rational brain was unplugged and pure rage surged into the open space. The first hit landed before I even processed what I was doing. My fist connected, and he toppled sideways, scrambling for balance, but not moving fast enough. My girlfriend screamed, reaching out to grab me, and I shoved her aside without thought or aim, locked on only to him. He tried again to push himself upright, but I was already on him, closing the gap in seconds. I swung again and again until his arms stopped coming up to shield himself. Every blow blurred together. My knuckles split, my breathing turned ragged. His body sagged under the weight of the strikes. The anger didn't drain with the hits. It surged higher, feeding itself like it was on an endless loop. I wasn't landing punches on a person anymore. I was unloading on months, maybe years, of trust that had just crumbled in front of me. Each strike was a desperate attempt to put that betrayal back out of existence, to force it out of my home. And then his body stopped fighting back. He collapsed onto the carpet, curling in on himself, no strength left to do anything else. But I didn't stop. I kept pushing, fists striving until he went limp and his head bounced against the floor with a sound I still can't get out of my ears. That moment finally broke the red haze enough for me to realize what had just happened. The kid wasn't just hurt, he was barely conscious. Blood smeared across the sheets and the floor, running from the side of his face where my fists had landed most. Later, I learned the full cost: a concussion, stitches, bruises. That would last for weeks. In those seconds, his injuries were written in how twisted his body looked underneath mine and the way his chest moved shallow and slow. I stood over him with my hands trembling, knuckles bleeding, breath shaking my whole body. My girlfriend's voice cut through, but I couldn't process the words. She was crying, panicked, somewhere between trying to pull me back and trying to comfort him. Both of us were staring down at the ugly aftermath of what I'd just done. And the truth hit harder than a punch had. I had crossed a line I could never step back from. In that living room, just moments before, all the sympathy had been mine. I was the betrayed partner blindsided by a girlfriend's lies. But with fists flying, the script rewrote itself. In an instant, I wasn't the victim anymore. I looked like the monster. She was sobbing, he was sprawled out bleeding, and I stood above them both, furious and shaking. Rage had stolen whatever high ground I had and thrown it out the window. Here's the legal reality I didn't think about until much later. Betrayal, humiliation, heartbreak. None of it justifies violence in the eyes of the law. No matter how raw the provocation, you don't have a free pass to beat someone unconscious. And that's exactly what I had done. In that split second where control broke, I'd handed the law an airtight case: aggravated assault. They wouldn't see the betrayal, the lies, the excuses echoing in my ears. They'd see bruises, stitches, and hospital records. And those don't lie. It's strange, looking back, how a metaphor that felt funny, me as the Hulk flinging punches, turns painfully literal in hindsight. Because unlike in comic books, Hulk doesn't calm down and reset the scene. He leaves a trail of destruction you can't sweep away. That was me. No clever one-liners, no redemption arc. Just a guy who let fury do the talking, and in doing so, rewrote himself from the wronged boyfriend into the criminal aggressor. I can imagine 100 other choices. Walking away, yelling, grabbing a bag and leaving, even just standing still until the heat drained out. Any outcome would have been less final than the one I picked. But I didn't pull myself back. I let it run me, and then I stood shaking in the wreckage, staring down at a college kid's unconscious body and realizing I wasn't defending my dignity at all. I was destroying it. The scariest part is how fast it all happened. Rage doesn't measure itself in hours. It takes seconds, maybe less, to detonate everything. What started as heartbreak ended with me glaring down at blood on my own carpet, while my girlfriend cried in the corner of the room, already shifting the story in real time to cast me as the monster. And honestly, she didn't have to twist much. The scene already handed her all the evidence. When you're in it, rage feels like release. But once it fades, you're left with silence and the sound of your own ragged breath, and the room looks like a battlefield where you're the only one standing. It doesn't erase betrayal. It doesn't make grief smaller. It just makes the wound bigger and drags you down into a place that betrays yourself as much as anyone else. And the worst part? That explosion didn't stay contained within the walls of that apartment. The neighbors get a free show. Sound carries easily in buildings like mine, and every crash, scream, and thud didn't stop at the bedroom door. It traveled right into the plaster and straight through to the neighbors' apartments. I wasn't only unraveling in private, I was broadcasting the whole disaster through walls that were never built to keep secrets. The layout of that complex made it impossible to hide. Paper-thin walls meant you could hear arguments about dirty dishes or someone sneezing across the hall. So when fists landed and my girlfriend's voice rose into panicked cries, there wasn't a person within earshot who wasn't catching fragments of it. What to me was desperation bleeding out into violence became to everyone else a sequence of loud, undeniable signals, shouting, furniture hitting the floor, and a woman screaming over it all. Later, I thought about how it must have sounded from outside. People pausing mid-dinner, stopping their shows, all of them frozen at the exact moment they realized something more than a normal lover's quarrel was taking place upstairs. From the outside, there was no context, no backstory of betrayal or rage in their perception. It was just noise, ugly, violent noise, and the clarity of that fact hits me even harder now than it did then. Nobody needed to see what was happening to understand something was very wrong. If you hear fists connecting over and over, you don't stop to wonder about why. You assume one person is being beaten, and that assumption alone is enough to move people to action. In my case, those neighbors became witnesses the second they heard it. My voice wasn't proof of heartbreak, it was evidence of aggression. Every sound I made added another unintentional testimony. The truth is, I didn't think about them at all in that moment. I wasn't aware of eavesdroppers, of doors creaking open, of ears pressed against walls. But there they were, unwilling participants gathering their own versions of the story in real time. And those versions didn't need accuracy, they only needed consistency. Shouts, crashes, and cries. Even stripped of explanation, that was enough to make their story stronger than mine. This is where the sequence of events started leaving my control. Because when someone downstairs hears a man raging, a woman screaming, and more noise than any argument should ever create, they make a choice. My downstairs neighbor did exactly that. She picked up the phone, dialed 911, and reported the chaos happening above her head. That single act, one person calling for help, tipped everything from private catastrophe to documented police matter in minutes. It sinks in differently now than it did then. Inside, what felt like mere loss of self-control crossed almost instantly into something bigger because it wasn't just contained rage anymore, it was legally recorded violence. The neighbor didn't hear betrayed boyfriend or cheating girlfriend or college kid caught up in a mess. She only heard disorder, violence, panic, and she described it that way to the dispatcher. The words she used mattered. When officers were sent, they weren't coming in to mediate a disagreement. They thought they were walking into a dangerous assault in progress. And looking back, that's exactly what they had reason to believe. My neighbors gave the story away without ever intending to. Their ears confirmed what the building already held against me. The paper-thin walls turned every second into evidence for someone else to pass along. And when those sounds reached the police through that phone call, all of them translated the same way. I was the aggressor. The irony doesn't miss me now. On normal evenings, those same neighbors might complain about footsteps late at night or music bleeding from one apartment into another. But when this night hit, none of them could ignore what was shaking through those walls. They might not have had the details, but the noise painted a picture that felt indisputable. Someone upstairs was in danger. That conclusion was enough to bring help rushing in my direction, whether I wanted it or not. What happened to me in that room was messy and layered and full of history. But out in that hallway, in the ears of everyone listening, it was simple. They didn't hear betrayal. They didn't hear excuses that made me snap. They didn't get the backstory of edged trust and bottled hurt. They heard a sequence that spelled out violence clear as day. That clarity is what carried over the phone lines to emergency response. And that's what sparked a chain of events I couldn't stop. There's no neutrality when thin walls tell stories for you. Noise doesn't provide your side or anyone else's. It just blares out the ugliest parts, stripped of explanation. And once it left my apartment, it was interpreted the only way it could be, proof that something had to be done. The gossip and whispers I'd worried about later were irrelevant in that moment. What mattered was that the building itself had already made my actions public, and someone downstairs had given that publicity a number, 911. By the time that call was placed, the line between personal disaster and legal matter had already been crossed. What I didn't realize, pacing my own bedroom, was that the countdown had already started. Sirens would soon replace whispers. and men with badges would be at my door. And the story they were coming in to settle wasn't mine. Theirs had already been told for me, written by the sounds that made it through the walls. From cheated on to handcuffed. There's no soft way to describe when the cops came crashing in. 1 second I was still standing in the wreckage of my choices, and the next the front door flew open with a violent crack. They didn't knock, didn't hesitate, didn't pause for introductions. They entered like a storm, boots slamming against the floor, voices firing out commands, hands ready to pin me before I could blink. In that blast of sound and motion, my apartment wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to them, and I was just the problem they needed to neutralize. The officers moved with force that left no room for misunderstanding. They barreled straight past her and the kid and went right for me. In seconds, I was yanked away from where I'd been standing, slammed hard against the wall, my face pressed sideways into paint I'd rolled myself months ago. My arms were twisted behind me, wrists pulled together, and the cold light of metal snapped shut. Everything about the moment was fast, mechanical, and decisive. They didn't ask questions, didn't pause to hear me out. They restrained first and sorted later. Up until that moment, I was still caught in the dissonance of being cheated on while also acting like someone I barely recognized. To myself, I was the betrayed partner who had lost his head. But to them, to the neighbors peeking out at the hallway, and even to my girlfriend crying in the corner, I looked like someone dangerous. The police weren't seeing heartbreak or betrayal. They were seeing bloodied fists, a beaten 19-year-old on the floor, and a woman pointing at me with fear in her eyes. In minutes, my place in the story had been rewritten. The betrayed boyfriend didn't exist anymore. Now, I was the aggressor, cuffed and pinned as the cameras of neighbors' phones glowed faintly in the hallway. The shift was disorienting. A few hours earlier, I had been irritated over a headache, dreaming of a nap. Then I became the man discovering betrayal in his own bed. Now, pressed against my own wall with handcuffs biting deeper by the second, I was just another suspect in custody. I couldn't swallow how abrupt that transformation felt. None of my explanations, none of my perspective mattered in that scene. The evidence was stronger, a wounded kid, a crying girlfriend, and me restrained in the middle of it. They pulled me away from the wall and dragged me back toward the center of the room, their grip tight on my arms as if I might suddenly lunge again. I didn't resist. I couldn't. I was too far gone from the adrenaline, overwhelmed by the screaming silence left behind after the chaos. Still, their movements didn't ease. Their job wasn't to treat me gently. Their job was to end the violence, and in their eyes, I was the source. I caught enough fragments of her voice to know what story was already taking shape. She told them I had snapped, that she was terrified of what I might do next. She leaned into the role of victim with startling ease, every shaky word reinforcing the image of me as unpredictable and dangerous. Behind her, the kid sat bloody and dazed, head cradled in his hands, while an officer tried to keep him still until paramedics arrived. That tableau, the weeping girlfriend, the hurt college kid, and me being let out with bloody knuckles was all the framing anyone needed. The sting hit all over again when I realized no one there had a reason to doubt her. Why would they? She was crying and scared, clutching her chest as if she'd narrowly escaped more violence. The kid was battered, clearly injured, and his age only amplified the sympathy. And me, I had blood on my hands, literally. From the outside, it didn't take imagination to piece things together. To them, I was no longer the man blindsided by betrayal. I was the one who had turned a room into a crime scene. Once they had secured me, the cops pulled me toward the door. My wrists ached from the cuffs, the weight of their hold keeping me bent forward. As they marched me out, I caught glimpses through the hallway, neighbors standing half-hidden behind cracked doors, faces pale under the glow of building lights. Some looked horrified, some just curious, but either way, I was the showpiece being paraded through. Not her tears, not his injuries. Me. All they saw was the man being dragged out in chains. The air shifted when we hit the outside night, red and blue lights painting the building in flickers. The paramedics rushed past me, toward the apartment, carrying their kits to tend to the college kid. My girlfriend clung to an officer outside, repeating through dramatic sobs that she had been scared of me, that she never thought I'd lose control like that. Every word sealed my role further. To their ears, I wasn't just a man who lashed out. I was unstable, hard to predict, dangerous, and as much as I wanted to shout the truth, cuffed and surrounded by flashing lights, my voice didn't matter. The humiliation crushed down with more weight than the cuffs themselves, because in that moment, it wasn't betrayal on trial. It was me. And in the eyes of the cops and everyone watching from their windows, it looked like they had caught the villain mid-scene. That realization burned hotter than anything before. The back of the squad car was cold and cramped, the door shutting me into a small cage that smelled of stale sweat and rubber. I leaned back, feeling the cuffs dig into my skin harder now that there was no struggle to mask the pain. I realized with a sick weight in my gut that the night wasn't close to over. The apartment was behind me, but ahead was a station, hours of processing, and consequences I hadn't even begun to face. I didn't go home that night. Not the next night either. After the booking, fingerprints, and paperwork were done, I ended up in a holding cell for 2 nights, long enough to strip away any hint of dignity I still thought I had. Everything about it hammered home how fully roles had reversed. I had walked in earlier that day as the man betrayed, but I slept on concrete as the man arrested. That flip from victim to aggressor wasn't gradual. It was instant, and it was inescapable. The officers who pinned me didn't care about the heartbreak I walked into. My neighbors didn't care about why the fight started. My girlfriend didn't highlight her betrayal, only my explosion. The only part of the story anyone locked onto was violence, and violence is the fastest way to lose control of how others see you. By the time those 2 nights passed, I understood. Every explanation I wanted to make, every detail I thought might show them what led up to this, none of it carried weight anymore. The moment the cuffs closed, that part of the story was done. From then on, I wasn't the heartbroken man. I was the one in custody, waiting for what came next. And as I found out, what came next didn't look anything like the movies. It wasn't dramatic or thrilling. It was quieter, bleaker, and far more humiliating than anything I had expected. When jail becomes a sleepover. Jail isn't what you think it is when you've only seen it on TV. There's no dramatic clanging of bars, no hardened criminals glaring in the corner, no cinematic speeches about redemption. It's dull, colorless, and above all, humiliating. When they shut that metal door behind me, it didn't feel like punishment in some noble sense. It felt like being tossed into the worst overnight stay possible. Imagine a sleepover nobody asked for, complete with zero privacy, a paper-thin mattress, and a polyester orange outfit that smelled like it had hosted a dozen other broken men before me. 2 nights. That's how long I sat in holding before bail was posted. Those 2 nights dragged on endlessly, folding over themselves until I wasn't sure if it had been hours or entire days. The fluorescent lights never dimmed, humming overhead like they were mocking any attempt at rest. Sleep barely existed. You closed your eyes, shifted on the hard surface, tried to trick your body into shutting down, but the cold crept inside your bones until you gave up. They don't call it a holding cell for comfort. It's a place where time slows, and you're stuck with yourself, and with the dull ache of every bad decision that put you there. What hit me first wasn't physical discomfort, though. It was the uniform. That orange wasn't just fabric. It wasn't even a color anymore. It was a brand. It carried a message. This guy belongs to the county now. My personal life, my choices, my clean record, all of it shrank the second I put it on. I had never been arrested before this, never had a mugshot, nothing. And yet here I was, stamped and filed, just another case in a long line. The outfit didn't just cover my body. It erased whatever version of myself I thought I still was. Everyone in that room carried their own baggage, but we all blended together under the same light, sitting on the same cold benches. You notice strange details when you've lost control of your world. The metallic scrape of boots walking by outside. The rattle of a set of keys. The dry smell of bleach buried under an odor that never quite leaves. You hold on to those small things because they're all that distract you from the larger truth pulsing inside your head. And for me, that truth was clarity I couldn't run from. My relationship of 3 years had exploded on a single afternoon. I had beaten a 19-year-old so badly he needed hospital treatment. Concussion, stitches, bruises that would last longer than any excuse my girlfriend stammered out that night. And now I was being charged. Not with something light, not with a slap on the wrist. No, the words aggravated assault appeared early in the paperwork they shoved in front of me, and they felt like heavy steel bolted to my chest. It didn't matter what betrayal led me here. That would never erase the damage written in medical records. The first night, adrenaline still lingered just enough to keep me restless. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, my jaw stayed clamped tight, and every noise in the cell dug at me like a needle. But it faded, and when it did, I was left sitting in silence with nothing but regret. Not the repeated, noisy kind that wants you to spin excuses, but the flat realization I had thrown everything away for a handful of punches. A breakup could have been tragic. Losing her could have been survivable. A bruised ego heals, but a criminal record? That one carves scars into your life that outlast everything else. I thought about the college kid. He'd wake up with stitches, maybe nightmares, maybe shame for being caught in someone else's bed, but he'd move on. My girlfriend, she still had her apartment, her job, and her version of the story shaping itself even as I sat under buzzing lights. I, meanwhile, was sitting in neon orange, stripped of trajectory, stripped of dignity, reduced to the single story that had led me here. I lost control. Those 2 nights didn't just trap me inside a cell. They trapped me inside everyone else's perception. Neighbors had already whispered their versions. Friends would soon hear a spin detached from reality. My family, too. By the time my dad posted bail, the humiliation burned heavier than the legal charge. Watching him sign papers with his jaw clenched, his silence louder than anything he could say, that image burrowed into me. He didn't scold, didn't ask for my reasoning. He walked me out without a word, and in his silence I heard disappointment sharp enough to scrape bone. Release didn't feel like freedom. Stepping back outside only confirmed that the world had shifted. My apartment wasn't mine anymore. I couldn't even go back there to face the wreckage. My job, my social life, everything that tethered me to some idea of normal had been fractured. And the worst part was knowing this wasn't even close to the end. The 2 nights in holding were the prelude, not the punishment. Court was coming. Fines were coming. Maybe worse. Aggravated assault wasn't something you could shrug off and chalk up as youthful stupidity. It was the kind of charge that followed you job application after job application, proof lingering in records long after bruises faded. Humor tries to creep in when you look back. You want to laugh at the absurd details, the paper-thin mattress, the tasteless food, even the bootleg uniform they hand out like a costume. You want to gloss over it by calling it the world's worst Airbnb. But the laughter in the moment didn't exist. In the stillness of that cell, stripped of noise and distraction, all I felt was the weight of choices collapsing down on me. The hardest part wasn't the sleepless nights or the aching from a bench pretending to be a bed. The hardest part was realizing I wasn't walking out with a clean slate. Betrayal didn't vanish, but my reaction buried it beneath something worse. That fight stamped me with labels no apology could scrub away. That's what holding cells do best. They force you to see that the world outside will never think of you the same way again. When bail finally came and I walked into fresh air, I carried more weight than any bag I could have slung over my shoulder. Humiliation, legal chains that hadn't even tightened fully yet, and a story that I no longer controlled. And that loss of control, that shift from my reality to everyone else's version, is what came next. Cheater goes free, victim gets blamed. The strangest part wasn't the cell or the cuffs. It was watching the story shift right out of my hands and into hers. My girlfriend, this woman I trusted for 3 years, managed to recast herself almost instantly. She wasn't the one caught betraying our relationship. No, in her version of events, She was the terrified woman with tears streaking her face, a voice shaking as she whispered how she hadn't known what I would do next. She sold that picture so well, it started to feel like the truth for everyone else in the room. To the cops, the neighbors, even the paramedics, I wasn't the man who had just walked in on his worst nightmare. I was the violent boyfriend who snapped. And once that label took hold, it stuck harder than the cuffs on my wrists. The way she told it, she had survived some horror story. She removed herself from the betrayal entirely. She never said a word about why a 19-year-old college kid was in my bed that afternoon. Instead, she painted herself as a victim of my eruption, pressing just the right emotional button so people could nod sympathetically. I towered in the background, fists bloodied, while her trembling voice filled the air about how scared she was. Nobody stopped to wonder what level of betrayal led to this mess. Once you've got a crying woman on one side, a beaten kid on the other, and me pressed against a wall in handcuffs, the caricature practically writes itself. Her version didn't just end when the cops left. It followed me even after booking, settled deeper into place when I finally stepped out on bail. She leaned all the way in. When I tried to contact her when I called after those 2 nights inside, her voice sliced sharper than the cuffs had. She told me to lose her number. Said I was a psycho. No conversation about her cheating. No ownership of the humiliation I'd walked into. Just a complete rewrite, and in her rewrite, I wasn't betrayed, I was dangerous. That word, psycho, ended up being her closing argument, delivered like a judge's gavel, sealing off any chance of her admitting what she had done. The kid didn't even need to spin it. Simply existing in the state I left him in, stitched up, concussed, bruised, he already owned the sympathy. Neighbors wanted updates on his recovery. Coworkers probably whispered about his bad luck at getting caught in the wrong apartment. He may have been half naked in my bed, but by the time the story spread, he was just a kid who took a beating from a man who couldn't contain himself. Meanwhile, what did I have? I had paperwork stamped with the words aggravated assault, listing exposure to a multi-year prison sentence between 2 and 5 years, depending on how strict a judge might feel. It sat in black and white, detached from the messy humanity of that day, boxed neatly under a criminal charge. There, betrayal meant nothing. Heartbreak didn't factor in. All the law cared about was the damage I caused, the concussion, the stitches, the photographs of bruises printed in evidence files. You could strip away every ounce of provocation, and the paperwork still pointed back only to me. The law doesn't deal with nuance. It doesn't ask if your girlfriend pled for forgiveness with one breath and then called you a psycho the next. It doesn't ask if neighbors only heard the noise without context. It looks at the facts. One person threw punches, the other ended up unconscious and hospitalized. I became the assailant, while she was the distressed partner, and he was the victim of an assault. Nobody in the system felt the need to attach footnotes about cheating, broken trust, or betrayal. It was violence in a vacuum, stripped of cause. The court, the DA, the paperwork, they only had interest in my actions. She could rebuild her image overnight. I could not. And that's the real sting. Betrayal is not illegal. Infidelity doesn't land you in court. Cheating won't get your mugshot taken or sit you under buzzing fluorescent lights for 2 nights straight. But violence? That hits the system like a sledgehammer. It doesn't matter what pulled the trigger. Once you do the damage, you own it in ways the betrayer never has to. She got to retreat to her sister's place, rebuild her image, and tell people she had escaped someone unbalanced. The 19-year-old kid got to limp away with sympathy, framed as the unlucky party who stumbled into a storm. I alone carried the record, the mugshot, the exposure to prison time. That double betrayal left me hollow. At first, it was the personal wound, the sight burned into my memory of her with him in my bed. But the second betrayal cut deeper. It was public. It was deliberate. She excused herself from the mess she made, then wrapped the fallout neatly around me. For years, I had been loyal, steady, certain of who I was. In a matter of days, she erased all of that. To everyone else, I was the violent psycho she claimed I had always been. And once that picture is painted, Every detail that doesn't fit gets cropped out of the frame. It is surreal, the way you can lose ground so fast. A few hours of chaos and suddenly nothing else counts. Not the years of trust, not the promises, not the facts about who actually crossed what line first. None of that carried legal weight or social sympathy once the story hardened against me. All that stuck was the single undeniable act. I lashed out until someone was left bleeding. That alone outweighed everything else, and that's what stamped me forever. What I didn't understand, at least not right away, was how fast those ripples spread beyond that apartment, beyond that night, beyond the courtroom. They don't stop at betrayal or handcuffs or bail papers. They keep going until you realize the 10 minutes you lost control are about to cost you far longer. Ripple effect of a 10-minute meltdown. What hit hardest wasn't just the charge itself. It was how fast the consequences seeped into every corner of my life. It kept unfolding, one ripple after another, reshaping everything I knew about stability and control. First came the formal reality, aggravated assault. Seeing my name stamped on court paperwork under that label didn't just sting, it rewrote who I was on paper. I'd spent 28 years without so much as a parking ticket. In one afternoon, that clean slate was gone. Instead of ordinary plans for the week, work, bills, weekends, my calendar filled with lawyer consultations, arraignment hearings, and the looming threat of years behind bars. The district attorney's office didn't understate it either. The formal charge carried exposure to 2 to 5 years in state prison. It was a possibility I couldn't ignore no matter how much I tried to downplay it in my head. But the law doesn't just drain your time and dignity, it empties your wallet too. The background noise of my life shifted to invoices and fees. Lawyers don't settle for sympathy, they bill in hours. Court filings cost money. Scheduling conflicts with hearings meant missed workdays and smaller paychecks. And that was just the start. The medical bills from the assault carried their own brutal weight. The college student parents made it very clear early on that they intended to recover costs. This emergency room visit, concussion treatment, and stitches stacked up to roughly $8,000. There was talk of pursuing a civil suit on top of the criminal case. My lawyer later negotiated it down into a $5,000 settlement, but even that number gutted me. To put it bluntly, my meltdown turned into a tab I couldn't afford. I basically paid thousands of dollars for the privilege of destroying my reputation. Work didn't stay untouched either. I had held my position for years, showed up early, hit deadlines, avoided drama. None of that mattered once the arrest became public. Employers don't like seeing your name tied to courtroom dockets. I didn't have the luxury of explaining infidelity or heartbreak. HR departments care about liability, not context. First came the unpaid administrative leave. They phrased it as time to address personal matters, but it was clear what they were really doing. Distancing themselves from me. The final blow landed weeks later, a formal termination notice. One violent outburst had cost me the career I had been steadily building. Housing followed the same slide. Our landlord didn't look twice at the circumstances. From his perspective, police had stormed through his property, someone had left blood on the floors, and other tenants whispered about safety. Soon after I was released on bail, I got a written notice to vacate. No hearing, no chance to argue. Just a 30-day timeline to figure out where I was going while already drowning in legal fees. Betrayal had ripped apart the inside of my apartment, but my outburst pulled up the very foundation of having a home at all. The social fallout cut along quieter edges, but still dug deepest. Neighbors who used to wave at me in the parking lot now avoided eye contact altogether. Doors closed a little faster whenever I walked by. They hadn't seen the scene in detail, but they had seen enough. The flashing lights, the officers dragging me out, cuffed, the paramedics helping a beaten kid. To them, there was no complexity. I was branded in one phrase, the guy arrested for assault. That single label erased whatever else they knew about me. What made it sting worse was remembering how preventable it all was. If I had simply walked out that afternoon, she would have carried the shame. She, not me, would have been the one neighbors whispered about for months. Instead, my 10 minutes of rage handed her the role of victim while my reputation unraveled in full view. And reputations don't heal the way skin does. A busted knuckle closes and scars. Public opinion doesn't fade so easily. I thought the legal part would be the hardest. Going in front of a judge, hearing the charges read out. That seemed like the mountain. But the truth is, it was everything attached that weighed more. The financial collapse of scrambling to pay for lawyers and settlements. Losing my job when I needed paychecks most. Being forced to move out when stability mattered. Watching the people I passed daily look at me like I turned into something poisonous. Those things stacked heavier than the paperwork because they were constant reminders that life itself was no longer the same shape. When my lawyer told me the DA was willing to discuss a plea, it felt like hearing about a lifeline tied with barbs. The possibility reduced the charge to misdemeanor assault, agree to 18 months of probation, complete a set number of community service hours, and enroll in anger management classes. On paper, it sounded like a mercy compared to state prison. In practice, it meant years of my life boxed under supervision with every step tracked and judged. It was a compromise between freedom and punishment, and whether I accepted or not, it still stamped me with a record that didn't erase. The irony gnawed at me continuously. Betrayal doesn't show up in courtrooms. Cheating doesn't carry fines. Technically, she walked away untouched. No hearings, no settlement demands, no orange uniforms. A moral failure doesn't translate into a criminal one. But the moment I swung fists instead of walking away, everything shifted. Betrayal might have triggered everything, but my violence sealed the deal. She walked on while I paid the bill, financially and socially. The 19-year-old she cheated with left with scars and sympathy. I was the one left permanently tethered to defendant as part of my identity. And that is what makes a meltdown like this so destructive. Not the single strike of rage, but the way consequences echo out long after. They echo into your bank account, into your resume, into your housing applications, into your reputation. A few minutes can redraw everything, and the redraw doesn't look like you anymore. It looks like the worst moment you've ever had, preserved, repeated, and carried forward into every room you step into afterward. I replay it now, not because I want pity, but because the clarity stings. Betrayal eventually dulls. Heartbreak, as brutal as it is, softens with time and distance. But rage doesn't fade so easily. Rage translates into papers, fines, losses, labels, and those things can lock themselves onto you for years. That's the ripple effect. What happens when you trade 10 minutes of release for consequences that stretch until you forget what life looked like before. That's why I call it the biggest sabotage I ever committed against myself. Not because she didn't wrong me, not because betrayal didn't fracture something real, but because my reaction turned her wrong into my downfall. The cycle kept spinning outward. More debt, more judgment, more doors closing, and none of it restored the pride I thought I was defending when I snapped. And yet, in the middle of that collapse, I learned something strange about stories like this. As much as I lost, as much weight as I carried, I wasn't the only one moving forward under a shadow. The consequences didn't stop with me. They traveled outward, reshaping her life too, though not in courtrooms or police reports. In her world, different kinds of fundamentals started catching up, and that part came with a twist I didn't see coming. The comedy of cosmic justice. Cosmic justice doesn't arrive in tidy packages, but sometimes it shows up with a grin that feels almost theatrical. While I was tangled in court dates, settlements, and the cold reality of probation, she faced a different kind of collapse. The image she had worked so hard to polish cracked quickly. What she had built through tearful claims of fear and victimhood didn't stand long once our circle learned the truth. She wasn't blameless. She had been cheating. And not just once. Word spread that my discovery wasn't an isolated mistake. It was at least the second time she'd broken the relationship. Messages from friends hinted at rumors she'd been reckless before, and the sympathy that clung to her story right after my arrest drained away fast. At first, she still tried to keep the mask in place. Social media showed cheerful quotes and posts about new beginnings, but offline, the tone shifted. Friends who once defended her became less responsive. Texts went unanswered, and invitations grew scarce. It's hard to sell a story of being terrified of your partner when people keep replaying the detail you can't erase. But the 19-year-old in the apartment was real, and so was her choice. Co-workers, roommates, acquaintances, everyone carried whispers about it. The polished narrative she offered the night of my arrest never fully survived daylight. Labeled as manipulative rather than misunderstood, she found herself drifting on the outer edges of circles that had once felt safe. Her victim image corroded in front of the same people she thought would protect it. The relationship she had risked so much for evaporated almost instantly. The college student who seemed to matter in that catastrophic moment didn't stay. Once the embarrassment caught up, he cut ties and faded back into campus life, unwilling to play boyfriend after being branded the kid who threw himself into someone else's mess. What she had traded years of steady partnership for wasn't a new chapter, it was a footnote. That kind of irony has no sympathy. To the outside world, she lost more than just a partner. She lost dignity chasing something that never even stuck around. Her stability didn't last long after that. The apartment we shared stopped being viable the moment I was gone. She was still on the lease, but the burden of paying it alone dragged her under. She tried asking friends to move in, but the request itself carried stigma. Most quietly avoided tying their finances to hers. The same reputation that corroded her friendships bled into her housing. What was once a shared home turned into a weight she couldn't carry. I eventually learned she bounced around, trying to recapture footing, but housing is unforgiving when trust has been broken in the very walls people are asked to share. Work wasn't much kinder. Our histories overlap enough that updates trickled down my way. Her colleagues learned the same truth: her cheating wasn't gossip confined to one night. Once word made its way into that environment, she struggled to hold her place. Showing up daily to coworkers who understood that the psycho boyfriend line wasn't the full story became its own form of humiliation. The clean restart she bragged about online wasn't a choice, it was necessity. Leaving one job for another sounds positive when paired with motivational captions, but in her case, it was survival. Her reputation evaporated quicker than any professional title could restore. I heard more, piece by piece. After enough shifting and instability, news started circulating about her life taking another unexpected turn. Reports said she became pregnant not long after things came apart and carried it to term. The updates confirmed it. Eventually, she became a single mom. That detail stuck because of what it illustrated. Actions always leave a trail. She hadn't escaped accountability with her polished story about a violent partner. She just encountered it in quieter but persistent ways, through whispers, lost trust, unstable housing, instability at work, and eventually raising a child on her own. It wasn't punishment in the way mine had been, written in charges in courtrooms, but it was a kind of consequence that reshaped her future all the same. The balance was never even. I carried the weight of police reports, legal bills, and a record that would shadow me everywhere I went. She carried social fallout, abandonment by her short-term fling, financial instability, and a reputation that softened her support system into distance. Those outcomes aren't comparable in scale, and they don't erase what I lost. But the irony sits plain. The person who painted herself as the sole victim didn't skip away untouched either. If there's any blemish of humor, it comes through in how unevenly those blows landed. My crash was spectacular: sirens, handcuffs, headlines written into files. Hers was slower, private, stretched out across hushed conversations of friends pulling away. Mine showed up in a courtroom, hers in a phone that stopped lighting up. Both of us stumbled from the wreckage, but only one of us bore the scars that the legal system never forgets. That contrast isn't revenge. It isn't karmic balance delivered cleanly. It's just the reality of how choices ripple. What you do in rage and what you do in betrayal, they both cost something, just in very different currencies. And in watching both our lives spiral for different reasons, the only lesson left standing wasn't about justice, it was about consequence. Hers bruised reputation, mine a criminal record. Two different collapses, but both proving the same point. Choices don't end in the moment you make them. And that truth leaves a sour kind of clarity. Because while her fallout came quietly and privately, mine reshaped my entire future. One of us received rumors, the other received charges, and it's that difference that still weighs heavier than anything either of us lost in whispers. Which is why the ending of this story doesn't focus on her outcome, but on mine, and on the blunt mistake driving it. I ended up taking a plea deal. Misdemeanor assault, 18 months probation, 100 hours of community service, 26 weeks of anger management, plus fines and fees that drained my bank account. That was the official outcome, and it gave me closure I couldn't find anywhere else. The takeaway is simple. Cheating destroys trust, but violence can destroy your future. Losing control for 10 minutes handed me consequences that will follow for years. So I'll put it to you. What's the wildest excuse you've ever heard from someone caught cheating? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, remember to like and subscribe. For now, I'm doing the work the court ordered, and I'm telling this story not to justify what I did, but to warn against making the same mistake.